third of our panels in this year's annual Center for the Study of World Religions, Studying Religions Across the Disciplines conference. This afternoon's panel, the first of two, is called Religion, Rights, Ethics. And I'm very pleased to introduce at least one of our speakers and our respondents. Our first speaker, Luke Brotherton from Duke University, had a bit of a family tragedy last week and is not able to join us. He did, though, under some duress, for which I'm very grateful, send us his paper. So I am simply going to read his paper. The respondents have had it, and it's a very interesting study in multiple ways. So hopefully at least it can generate some discussion, even though it's so far outside my area of expertise, I can't possibly do any justice to it. But let me tell you at least a little bit about its author. Professor Brotherton's primary teaching interests are theological ethics, Christian political thought, missiology, and practices of social, political, and economic witness. Before joining the Duke faculty, he was a reader in theology and politics and convener of the Faith and Public Policy Forum at King's College London. Prior to that, he was the director of studies of the Southeast Institute for Theological Education at the University of Kent, which prepared Methodist, Reformed, and Anglican ministers for ordination. He's worked with a variety of faith-based NGOs around the world, mission agencies, and churches, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. Our live, genuine speaker, the authentic article here, is Charles Lesh. Charles is a PhD candidate in the Harvard Government Department and a graduate fellow at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics here at Harvard. His work lies at the intersection of political theory, moral psychology, social theory, and the study of religion. His dissertation probes the relationship between pre-political social obligations, for example, hospitality, self-sacrifice, and reciprocity, and religious forms of cognition, community, and moral epistemology. Drawing from thinkers as diverse as Levinas, Habermas, Hegel, Durkheim, Adorno, and the ever-popular at this conference, William James, he develops, this will be the third panel where William James is about, he develops, we should have called it the William James.
It's not too late.
That's right, it's right to change that. Maybe we should change the center's name. He develops an original theory of how citizens in diverse societies become alert to everyday injustices and take moral responsibility for one another. The historical dimensions of this research project center around continental philosophy from the late 18th to the late 20th century, with an emphasis on German idealism, the Frankfurt School, and critical theory, modern and classical Jewish thought, and the development of civil society, focusing on questions of pluralism and social integration. His article on Walter Benjamin, Kant, and Jewish political theology appeared in the American Political Science Review this past February. I am ever grateful and pleased to introduce to you our two respondents. Our first respondent will be Tara Dunkel. Tara is in the final year of her PhD in the study of religion here at Harvard. Her dissertation focuses on the intersection of Foucauldian ethical subject formation and environmental ethics. Recent publications include Public Rationality and Performative Religiosity in the online journal Symposia, and a review of Simon O'Sullivan's On the Production of Subjectivity, 5 diagrams of the finite-infinite relation in the forthcoming issue of Foucault's Studies. Our second respondent will be Professor Diane Moore. Diane Moore focuses her research on enhancing the public understanding of religion through education from the lens of critical theory. She is the director of the Religious Literacy Project, coordinator for the Religious Studies and Education Certificate, and serves on the editorial boards of the journals Religion and Education and the British Journal of Religious Education. Moore served as chair of the American Academy of Religion's Task Force on Religion in the Schools, which conducted a 3-year initiative to establish guidelines for teaching about religion in K-12 public schools. Her book, Overcoming Religious Literacy, A Cultural Studies Approach to the Study of Religion in Secondary Education, was published by Palgrave in 2007. So without further ado, I will pretend to be Luke Brotherton. I was thinking, I looked at his picture online, maybe I should put on like a 3-piece suit and a tie. At any rate, I'll do what I can here, and I'm sorry that I can't do it justice. At least I'll try to read with feeling. So the title of his talk is Contract, Covenant, and Debt, Expanding Conceptions of Democratic Citizenship. Through the prism of debt and usury, this paper contrasts gift-based or covenantal conceptions of citizenship with those that undergird contractual rights-based conceptions. This contrast serves as the basis for examining the thesis that contractual and rights-based conceptions of citizenship are premised on collapsing distinct patterns, habits, and forms of relationship into the exchange of equivalents. Think the sheep and the herders from the morning's talk, for those of you who are here. The constructive argument in this paper focuses on the need for social contract and rights-based conceptions of citizenship to allow for more expansive conceptions of reciprocity and to include a broader range of forms of sociality. Why this is so necessary becomes apparent when we consider the relationship between democratic citizenship and debt, something we probably know something about. What is in view more broadly but tacit within the discussion presented here are two questions. The first is whether the language of gift rather than rights is a more generative way of framing discussions of religious beliefs and practices in interdisciplinary conversations. The second is how schemas of salvation and sacrifice, whether political or religious, coordinate the relationship between gift and debt, and thereby answer the central question: do we owe deities? What do we owe deities, the dead, and our dependents? The first section, Athens, democratic politics as the means to limit the power of money. In ancient Athens, there was a direct link between property and citizenship. Only property-owning men could be full citizens. There were also strict regulations on how land could be bought and sold, and a key outcome of the fight for democracy was that if you were a citizen, you could not be made a debt slave. Whether democracy emerged as a result of a rapid increase in debt slavery due to a breakdown in law and order, or disputes among wealthier landowners and poorer families who had lost or were in danger of losing their land, and who were therefore risked being forced into debt slavery, is a matter of considerable scholarly dispute. What is clear is that debt and the emergence of democracy were inextricably linked, as the Visa Corporation apparently knows. This linkage is reflected in Aristotle. Writing some 200 years after the reforms that laid the foundations of democracy in Athens, Aristotle sees the demand for an amnesty of debts and an ending of debt slavery as absolutely central to the origins of democracy. For Aristotle, politics was in part a means through which the common institutions of self-government preserved the sense of community necessary to subordinate the power of money to the pursuit of the common good. Aristotle's condemnation of usury should be seen in this light. It is born out of a concern for the maintenance and health of the body politic and is not a reductively economic concern. Lending and borrowing were to be situated within the relations of fellowship that reflected the obligations of citizenship and were not to be subordinated to the pursuit of money as an end in itself. For Aristotle, usury led to the fracturing of the proper relationship among citizens. Aristotle condemns the usurer. Like the pimp, he says, he takes more than he ought from the wrong sources and for reasons of sordid gain. Aristotle's treatment of usury fits within his wider interrogation of the relationship among commercial trade, money, and citizenship. The heart of the problem for Aristotle was the pursuit of money as an end in itself. The pursuit of money as an end in itself, through either usury or unregulated commerce divorced from any involvement in a social and political community, led to a disturbed form of desire, my Greek is non-existent, planexia, or rapacious desire. While money is necessary, is either a medium of exchange, a store of value, or a means of accounting, for Aristotle, the practice of money-making, as distinct from production and trade, threatens the polis because it makes the pursuit of profit an end in itself, and in doing so not only turns money from its natural end, but also, through this rapacious desire, becomes the enemy of citizenship as it undermines the pursuit of civic virtue and justice. The collective liberty of self-governing citizens and their virtual pursuit of the common good are undermined by commercial and competitive values that prioritize the self-interested pursuit of property and consumer goods. In contrast, Jerusalem, gift and law as the basis of a covenantal vision of citizenship. We find an analogous set of concerns in the Bible. At the heart of salvation narratives in both the Old and New Testaments, we discover the power of money and liberation from debt slavery are central concerns. A primary narrative template for understanding salvation is given in the book of Exodus, where the central dramatic act is liberation of the Israelites from debt slavery in Egypt. The canonical structures of both Genesis and Exodus in the ordering of Scripture makes this point repeatedly. The book of Genesis closes with the story of Joseph. At the end of this account, although saved from famine, the Israelites, along with everyone else in Egypt, are reduced to debt slavery. This is a voluntary process entered into in order to receive the grain from Pharaoh's stores that the people had given to Pharaoh for safekeeping in the first place. The inhabitants of Egypt come before Joseph and pledge their bodies and their land as security for the grain that they borrow. Therefore, they lack both the means to repay the debt and someone to pay it for them, as everyone is now indebted. The inevitable consequence is debt slavery on a massive scale. The first chapter of Exodus opens with a new Pharaoh who takes advantage of the Israelites' debt slavery in order to exploit them. So the Israelites were not prisoners of war or chattel slaves, they were debt slaves undertaking forced labor on behalf of the ruling elite. It is this condition from which the Israelites are specifically redeemed. In the Gospels, Exodus is one of the key framing narratives that shape the presentation of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. The notion of redemption, or Jesus paying with his life in order to liberate humans from our debt of sin, is a leitmotif, obviously, of the New Testament. Indeed, the declaration of Jubilee, that is, the release from debt bondage, forms the basis of how Luke frames Jesus' announcement of his purpose and mission. What Luke then depicts in Act 2 as a direct fruit of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit is the enactment of the Jubilee community where no one has debts because, quote, all who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need, end quote. So the admonition that we cannot serve both God and mammon, that's from Matthew, is not a trivial matter. The central drama of salvation history is an act of liberation from debt bondage. To put the pursuit of money before the welfare of people, and to use money to dominate and exploit people, especially the poor and vulnerable, is, in other words, to turn your back on God's salvation and deny in practice the revelation given in Scripture of who God actually is. However, to use money to strengthen the commonwealth, and in particular to relieve the poor, is a mark of having received salvation. Usury, redemption, and legislative limits. This brings us to the specific scriptural teaching of when and how to lend. Indicative of the direct teaching on lending is the following from Exodus 22, chapter 25. Quote, if you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you shall not deal with them as a creditor. You shall not exact interest from them, end quote. As is set out in Psalm 15, not lending at interest is directly equated with righteousness. To profit from a loan to a fellow Israelite with whom one has a kinship relation is to make God himself an enemy. To engage in usury, in the absolutist sense of receiving any profit from a loan, is not only to have no fear of God, but also to oppose oneself to God through treating God's elect as an enemy. That is, to act as one whose manner and way of living is directly opposed to and a threat to God's covenantal ordering of life. This political action against God and his people can only result in death to the usurer, that from Ezekiel. Locating oneself as an enemy of God and his people is not exclusive to the sin of usury. Bribery, theft, adultery, and other sins equally place one in opposition to God's order. However, the proper ordering of lending and borrowing and their effects on the right ordering of communal relations are at least equal, if not greater, concern in the various legislative codes. This is because the proper relationship between the land and the people is at stake. The land and fellow Israelites were non-fungible goods given by God as gifts for the flourishing of all. Possession of land did not entitle the holder to exclusive use. Rather, it was a non-exclusive usufruct. Human ownership and use of created goods was limited because God is the ultimate owner. Humans are stewards and priests of what they have received from God. To convert land or people into fungible goods of no greater value than anything else is not only to instrumentalize them for one's own benefit, and so place one's welfare above the good of all, but to usurp God's own title. In modern parlance, we call such a process commodification, the treating of that which is not for sale as a commodity to be bought and sold. The extensive manumission laws of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy relate to debt slavery and are measures to keep in check such a process of commodification of both land and people. Usury and covenantal relations. The concern about lending money and the proper treatment of those in debt can be heard as simply pertaining to the proper ordering of economic relations. However, this is to decouple, in a peculiarly modern way, what we might call the status of the citizen from questions of economics. To participate as a full member of the covenantal community or organized body politic required a land holding. Land provided the basis for the right and obligation to participate in legal assemblies and to act in common ventures such as defense, and to be present representatively at festivals. To be without land meant one was without the necessary power or agency in relations of mutual responsibility, and thence one was unable to fulfill one's covenantal obligations. This in turn affected the holiness of the people as a whole, because the quality of covenantal relations broke down since, and I can't say the Hebrew, it means justice and righteousness, the term for the complex of obligations and rights that are the basis of the God-given social order that can no longer be fulfilled. Thus, the land in general, and familial land holdings in particular, are central to the organization and identity of ancient Israel as a body politic. To make those subject to covenantal obligations into debt slaves and permanently expropriate their land is to simultaneously undermine the political order and the character and identity of the people. It is in a communicative vision of property relations as the basis for a shared life, premised on the ability of each having agency within the whole, that we find the root of an alternative vision of property relations to privatized and socialized conceptions, and even some recent reconceptions of the commons, a term much in play in the first talk in the morning. It is a vision echoed in many reflections on what is necessary for a stable republic. Obviously, the negative side of this is that restrictions on who can own land, mostly adult men, and the distribution of land holdings, often restricted to a particular class, are thus directly linked to who has potential agency. Nevertheless, such visions do take seriously the link between material and political agency that are central to notions of social citizenship. In the modern period, when people no longer have land and are dependent on employers for money and banks for credit, there is a question of how people may undertake independent political action in collaboration with others when they no longer have economic autonomy. Debt as domination. Contemplating the relationship between debt, money, and citizenship unveils how debt can be a form of domination. By way of contrast to my emphasis on the oppressive consequences of indebtedness as a particular problem that democratic citizenship seeks to address, there is a long tradition of seeing hereditary chattel slavery as the paradigmatic form of domination that modern accounts of citizenship, particularly in North America, are responding to. For example, Jeffrey Stout sees all forms of domination subsequent to hereditary chattel slavery, patriarchy, heterosexism, etc., as being framed as analogous to chattel slavery. But the emphasis on hereditary chattel slavery tends to occlude domination by the power of money and debt as a form of domination. This is because the forms of domination that arise from indebtedness, debt slavery, and debt bondage are not analogous to hereditary chattel slavery, since they are voluntarily entered into, and the relationship is seen to result from a form of free exchange. This free exchange is itself located within a spontaneous and natural order, and so perceived as legitimate. Within such a context, the history of usury is important because it opens up an imaginative and conceptual space through which the mythos of the capitalist economy as the sphere of spontaneous and natural relations of free and equal exchange can be contested. Debt bondage, and the desecration of common life. The paradox unveiled by debt bondage is that contractual equality can establish non-recognition of parity within a common life. What debt bondage reveals is that power can be exercised in a wholly accountable, non-arbitrary manner without physical coercion and on the basis of a presumed equality, yet entirely strip one of dignity and recognition as a fellow human being. Whereas chattel slavery operates by violently ripping people from their contexts so that they are thoroughly dehumanized and removed from all that constitutes them as persons in relations with others, debt bondage constitutes a form of intense internal exile. Indebtedness is like digging a well for much needed water only to have the sides collapse as one digs, such that one is buried alive by the very means through which alleviation is sought. Maybe you just signed a mortgage, probably know what this means. Every time you turn on the light, buy food or clothes, get the bus or heat the house, you exacerbate the debt and actually make matters worse. One's means of living and existing socially becomes the means through which one is dominated and isolated. And more often than not, all of this occurs, in scare quotes, voluntarily and certainly legally. The evolution of usury as a term illuminates the interrelationship between voluntary action and coercion in the production of debt bondage. From the 12th century onward, in both the Christian and the Jewish traditions, there emerged distinctions between the legitimate charges on loans and usury, that is, the act or intention of taking profit on a loan. There is a wide-ranging and complex historical debate about how usury as a term evolves and changes throughout the medieval period. Key developments include the emergence of banking, processes of urbanization, and the religiously motivated attempt, quote, to frame the intellectual and moral conditions under which credit might be justly extended, end quote. What is clear is that from the 12th century, concessions to the prohibitions on usury emerge. Crucially, however, the common thread in all the concessions was the continuing subordination of economic to social relations and the distinction between legitimate profit and selfish gain. If mutual reciprocity could be maintained, as in the sharing of risk, then a profit could be made. Usury theory, along with the notions of a just price, was a way of conceptualizing the embeddedness of market relations within wider and prior moral and legal relationships. Where lending and interest does not threaten to reintroduce coercive relations but can maintain relations of reciprocity, then it is licit. Crucial here is whether the exchange involves compulsion or not. And here the scholastic debate over usury is directly relevant, focused as it was on the question of the relationship between need, free will, and compulsion. Responding largely to Aristotle, the key image was that of a ship's captain who has to throw his cargo overboard in a storm in order to save both his life and his ship. While an act of free will, it could hardly be said to be voluntary in any straightforward sense. At best, such action was forced by need and involved a mixed will. Likewise, the one who agrees to pay interest by dint of necessity or at a time of distress acts under duress. In such cases, lending at interest was an act of coercion and thereby unjust. On the account developed here, there was a proper debate to be had about non-coercive and commercial lending and the kinds of interest and charges that could be made on such loans. The key issue is whether the relationship involves reciprocity, equitable relations, and shared risk, i.e. forms of koinonia. Sorry, my Greek is bad. Where it is non-coercive and involves just relations and mutual benefit rather than selfish gain, it is licit. When it becomes coercive and fundamentally alters the relationship between the lender and the borrower, then it pertains to the public order of a polity and the question of who legitimately can exercise that coercive force. At this point, legislation is required in order to protect the needy and weaker party in the exchange. The most consistent and long-standing example of this kind of protection is a cap on interest rates. Legislative limits on interest rates are necessary to stop indebtedness being converted into debt bondage and thereby dissolving the conditions for equitable relations between members of the same body politic. Without such limits, there is no end to the power the usurer may exercise. In contrast to the kinds of borrowing relations cultivated by cooperatives and mutuals, debt bondage converts relations of equality into ones of domination. Giving does not of itself generate debt. The gift can simply be part of ongoing mutual aid or reciprocal recognition. To make the gift a debt transforms it and the relationships from those of either equality or reciprocal recognition to those of unequal hierarchy. Debt is thus an inversion of a gift. The subsequent conversion of debt into debt bondage and eventually debt slavery through the imposition of usurious interest rates is to render the condition permanent and make repayment, setting the matter straight, infeasible. Not only does this condition make dependence of one-time equals, but it makes an honorable relation into one of shame and immorality, honoring one's debts or obligations to others being a basic feature of most moral frameworks, and in certain contexts, it's even criminalized. Those who should be neighbors become strangers at best or enemies at worst. But what is acutely galling is that an emergency measure, a state of exception, to provide what another lacks in a time of need, becomes a permanent ordinance that indentures someone, all the while wrapping itself in the cloak of benevolence. A real need for credit is being provided by the usurer and is being accepted voluntarily. It is no wonder that the canceling of debts is a central demand of innumerable popular uprisings and rebellions from the ancient to the modern world. For the scholastics, maintaining economic relations so they reflect the reality of interdependence and mutual responsibility requires legal limits to ensure that the vulnerabilities involved in being lender or a borrower do not become occasions for exploitation, oppression, or abuse. It is to this need that the legislation concerning usury is addressed, and it is the order of fraternal interdependence and mutual responsibility that the act of usury opposes, making of the usurer an enemy of God and his people. Likewise, whether in the Athenian polis, ancient Israel, the Christian ecclesia, or the Muslim ummah, debt was a public issue as it related directly to the conditions of membership and the health of the Commonwealth. In the Christian world, up to and including the time of the Reformation, debates about usury understood the linkage between debt and the ability to sustain citizenship as a form of koinonia or fellowship. In the social contract tradition of modern political thought, from Hobbes and Locke onward, there is a shift away from a view of citizenship as a form of covenant, in which property was a communicative good, towards a more contractual view based on the exchange of equivalents, and in which property is seen in terms of absolute and exclusive ownership. Crucial here is the shift from natural rights to subjective rights. Citizenship becomes located within a vision of possessive individualism, in which freedom is a zero-sum game and not about mutual relations, in which the individual's freedom and fulfillment is constituted by relations with others. When freedom is based on absolute property rights rather than understood as the fruit of particular kinds of equal regard, koinonia, and good government, then freedom can be alienated, sold, and exchanged. Within a contractual framework, there is nothing wrong with a debt or wage slavery, if these are seen to arise from a legitimate, because voluntary, contractual exchange. With the shift to a contractual basis for political order, the need to place limits on debt, usury, and the uses of money wanes as a primary public concern. For example, the founder of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, writing in the 1780s, who Josh Green put up there briefly, expounded the influential view that anti-usury measures are both unnecessary and irrational. In the contemporary context, personal debt has ceased to be a threat to good citizenship and political order. Indeed, as Wolin and others have argued, the citizen is often conceptualized as a consumer, and the economy, not public or civic life, is demarcated as the sphere of free, uncoerced relations. On Wolin's account, liberalism identifies freedom with private interest rather than the pursuit of common action and shared advantage. The corollary of this is to grant the economy, the sphere of private interest and uncoerced relations, maximal scope and priority over the requirements of good government or the goods of any institution, whether it's family, farm, or factory. Economics becomes the queen of the sciences that can best tell us about how to order our common life. As a result, social harmony is no longer seen to issue from and be embedded within a prior set of social, institutional, and political arrangements, but is understood to flow from the spontaneous equilibrium of economic forces. Within such a vision, the status of the citizen becomes absorbed into that of the producer or consumer, or we might add, volunteer. Modern performances of citizenship tacitly envision debt as the condition of good citizenship, as debt sustains the dominant economic and political order, and its corollary, a mortgaged, debt-driven consumer culture in which social relations are mediated and represented through consumerist modes of common action and identity formation. In the contemporary context, it is the exchange of equivalence that is emphasized to the detriment of covenantal gift-based forms of relationship. This results in the flattening and hollowing out of our vision of political life. As Ricoeur notes, quote, "The golden rule given over to itself sinks to the rank of a utilitarian maxim. The rule of justice given over to itself tends to subordinate cooperation to competition, or rather to expect from the equilibrium of rival interests the simulacrum of cooperation," end quote. Contemporary understandings of citizenship need to expand beyond the framework of contract, and thence the exchange of equivalents, to encompass such forms of sociality as gift exchange, grace, and mutual sharing, none of which should be confined to the realm of the private, and each of which is necessary to temper and convert equivalent exchange. In short, neither contract nor catalepsy are sufficient to generate a tolerably peaceable polis. Also needed are forms of covenant and fellowship. The counter to processes of contractualization and commodification is the restitution of forms of covenant and fellowship and the connections they forge between people and places over time as part of the canvas of citizenship. Such a restitution is vital if we are to recognize others, including the weak and vulnerable, as having inestimable dignity and as participants in the common life. Such forms of gift relation directly foster the social bonds that are the prerequisite for and the basis of fuller visions of citizenship. In affirming the need to recognize the dignity of another, we must beware the kind of conceptual elision and confusion that frequently occurs with such a seeming affirmation. It is easy to hear the call to recognize the dignity of all as the rendering of each having equivalent value or being the same, but this is to make each person exchangeable and thence expendable. The philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy goes so far as to suggest that the emphasis on equivalence undergirds a practical nihilism that undermines democracy, but which is at the same time an inherent possibility within its modern forms. If everything is of the same value and to be valued in the same way, then nothing and no one is of any particular value. To affirm the dignity of all entails valuing the singularity of each and their infinite, incommensurable, and specific worth, and therefore their non-equivalence. The building and sustaining of a common life entails being able to recognize and value the non-equivalence of each person and group and their unique contribution to the whole. Liberal, egalitarian, and contractualist political visions are ill-equipped to do this. Don't shoot the messenger. Like capitalism, liberalism values direct equivalence and exchangeability. For example, Rawls's veil of ignorance is meant to strip away all vestige of particularity and context so that every person can be counted the same. Political and moral judgments that seek to be proportional and appropriate according to the specificity of the person, the place, and the circumstances involved, and therefore to be mutable, appear on his account to be immoral. Yet forms of relation built around covenant and fellowship are precisely ways of recognizing and valuing persons in non-equivalent ways. So while these forms of relation seem to contradict egalitarian commitments, the paradox is that they are necessary means of upholding and affirming the dignity of each person as a unique and incommensurable human being. Last paragraph. Tacit within this paper is a contrast between gift-based or covenantal ways of conceptualizing social relations and contractual ones. In a sense, this is a heuristic distinction, but it may be one that is worth exploring in how we frame discussion across disciplines about religious beliefs and practices, particularly as they pertain to the construction of the public sphere and the kinds of conflict that occur in the negation of religious and non-religious forms of life.
Right. Well, I wish our other speaker was here, because I think, as we're going to discover, there are some intriguing parallels between the work that I want to present to you today and his, and I wish there would be a chance for dialogue, but hopefully with all of you. I can take on both personalities. So I should say in advance, there are two handouts. I don't know if everyone saw that or got both. One of them is an outline of what I'm going to be talking about. The other is a sheet with quotations that I'll be referencing. So if you don't have both, just take a minute and grab. While everyone's doing that, let me just start by sincerely thanking Ann Monius and the Center for the Study of World Religions here at Harvard Divinity School for inviting me to participate in this conference. I'd also like to thank Tara and Diane for responding to our papers. It's really a great pleasure to be here, and I'm honored to share this podium with such a diverse and talented array of scholars. An interdisciplinary conference of this kind is really something I think we have all too rarely. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts and learning from you during questions. The title of my talk is Are Society and Religion Coextensive? Durkheim, Levinas, and the Sacred Foundations of Modern Social Solidarity. And I'd like to open with a quote from Jürgen Habermas, taken from an address he delivered shortly after September 11th, 2001. It's quotation 1 on your sheet. In moments like these, the unbelieving sons and daughters of modernity seem to believe that they owe more to one another and need more for themselves than what is accessible to them in translation of religious tradition, as if the semantic potential of the latter was still not exhausted. Since Habermas spoke these words, there's been a lively discussion in political theory over the role that religious expression should have in liberal democratic societies. Habermas himself had the following proposal. Instead of hostile opponents, religion and secular modernity should be partners. Each should be open to learning something from the other. Political theorists have had no end of suggestions for religious institutions. But the question of what exactly religion can teach political theory remains largely unexplored. Various proposals for achieving a so-called overlapping consensus, laudable as they may be, often take the form of détente rather than genuine dialogue. The actual content of religious beliefs and practices are almost always set aside, relegated to the black box of what John Rawls calls a comprehensive doctrine. Rarely are they taken seriously by political theorists. Thus, Habermas's remarks contain intriguing and unanswered questions. What insights can political theory glean from religion? In what moments do we most need them? And what more do we owe to each other? Today, I will offer one way of answering these questions via an original reading of Emmanuel Levinas. Levinas, in the tradition of Rousseau, Hegel, Durkheim, and Weber, was concerned with a theoretical conundrum that I term the puzzle of solidarity. It goes like this. On the one hand, to be a member of society means making room for other people. It requires some awareness of others, some modicum of sacrifice, some amount, however small, of self-transcendence. On the other hand, the question of how exactly such self-transcendence will proceed is difficult, complex, and fraught with danger. Consider just two cases. Going out of one's way to help a stranger is an act of altruism, but dying for a cause, or killing for a cause, is often morally uncertain and frequently morally evil. The key question then is the deep psychology of self-transcendence, not whether but how a person will step outside of herself. Will she retain her personality or lose herself in the collective? Will she respect the dignity of another or see individuals as mere instruments for achieving society's greater needs? Put another way, the puzzle of solidarity is this. How can we be brought to sacrifice for others without sacrificing moral selfhood, ours, and that of those around us? At the center of this puzzle is the role of religion. In the title of my talk, I pose what I hope is a provocative question. Are religion and society coextensive? In doing so, my point of reference is an enigmatic thesis developed by Durkheim in his Elementary Forms of Religious Life, that, quote, religion gave birth to all that is essential in society, and that society is the soul of religion. For Durkheim, there is a religious impulse at the heart of a human being. In the process of acting on this impulse, a person fulfills not only his own metaphysical needs, but the practical needs of society. The formation of norms, the birth of moral personality, the coming together of persons, the achievement of consensus, all are entwined with an original longing for transcendence, for reaching beyond the self. Social solidarity was thus thought by Durkheim to have sacred foundations. Even those not practicing a particular faith tradition participate unwittingly in religious forms of cognition and experience. Levinas, I will argue today, accepted Durkheim's basic thesis. He too saw a metaphysical impulse operating within every person. He concurred that there are religious features at work in apparently secular life, and he agreed that society and religion are coextensive. Yet whereas Durkheim drew a straight line from the most primordial forms of sacred experience to the most contemporary, from aboriginal totemism to the most austere monotheism, Levinas saw room for difference and contingency. If the human being's longing for transcendence was constant, the kind of societies that sprung up around this longing were highly variable. And this variation was not only of descriptive interest. The way we tend to the subterranean sacred facets of social life have profound moral and political consequences. In other words, what is at stake in how humanity approaches religious experience are opposing answers to the puzzle of solidarity. Some of these answers, for Levinas, lead to ethical life, individual dignity, and genuine social harmony. But others lead to violence, moral indifference, and self-dissolution. What matters is not if, but how self-transcendence proceeds. With these stakes in mind, Levinas, I will argue, offers an innovative solution to the puzzle of solidarity, one grounded in insights he draws from rabbinic Judaism. I will begin by discussing two pathological answers to the puzzle, each linked to religion, that Levinas identifies and diagnoses. One, which he traces to Hegel's theodicy, turns human beings into what we might call moral spectators, individuals who eschew responsibility for others by adopting a global perspective on human affairs. The result is a society characterized by callousness and moral indifference. A second pathology, which he associates with Durkheim's category of the sacred, suffers from the opposite problem. In the grip of the sacred, human subjectivity dissolves fully into an ecstatic and numinous social whole, failing to recognize any boundaries between self and other. The product is fanaticism, immorality, and frequently violence. I then turn to Levinas's response to these pathologies. Levinas, I argue, develops a novel theory of moral cognition by culling from Maimonides' negative theology. By turning man's relationship with God into a template for human ethics, the other person is made holy and inviolable, a channel for self-transcendence that avoids both moral indifference and sacred enthusiasm. I conclude by briefly outlining Levinas's practical moral program. Levinas, I suggest, develops his vision of solidarity by culling from two of Judaism's most evocative moral metaphors, the extension of hospitality to strangers and the offering of a sacrifice. These metaphors illustrate the process whereby a mere ego becomes a fully developed self, an I. We earn genuine human personality by making another's material needs our existential needs. To relieve our metaphysical vulnerability, we tend to another's physical vulnerability. The product is an innovative solution to the puzzle of solidarity, a society of individuals who are at once secure in their personalities and genuinely other-regarding. Yet if for Levinas religion is indispensable for solving the puzzle of social solidarity, it is religion of a very specific kind. In fact, the two pathological forms of solidarity he targets are each linked, in different ways, to varieties of religious experience. I turn to them now. The first of these pathologies, which he associates with Hegel, I call moral spectatorship. Here's not the place to examine Hegel's philosophy at length.
Oh, come on.
There are places, though, a few of them.
Cop out.
We'll talk after. But for purposes of explanation, let me note just a few of its key features. For Hegel, human history takes the form of a theodicy. In this way, he offers a novel answer to an ancient question. How can we reconcile the apparent evils of the world with God's perfection? Hegel's answer is that such evils only appear as evil from the limited perspective of the present. From the vantage of the end of history, by contrast, bloodshed and injustice will be redeemed because they will be shown to have been necessary to reach this utopian end state. Put another way, every event that is evil from our point of view is ultimately good from the point of view of history as a whole. In Hegel's most succinct language, the true is the whole. For Levinas, Hegel's theodicy is parasitic on ethics. The problem is its shift in perspective. By taking a teleological view of history, we come to see our behavior not from the second-person perspective of everyday ethical life, but from the third-person perspective of the totality. In other words, we abstract ourselves outward from our present circumstances, interpreting our actions not in themselves, but as parts of a larger social and historical system. Here's how Levinas poses the problem. Turn to quotation 2. At perceiving itself as universal, the individual has already slipped away from the responsibilities to which I, always contrasting with the ego, am bound, and for which I cannot ask replacements. the ego in consciousness reflecting on itself, both declinable as an object and protected by its unrendable form of being a universal subject, escapes its own critical eye by its spontaneity, which permits it to take refuge in this very eye that judges it. According to Levinas, then, whenever we assume the perspective of the totality, we abdicate our moral responsibility. We see ourselves not as individual ethical actors, but as mere components of a larger social system. The result is a callous moral epistemology. Take an everyday example, like encountering a beggar on the street. Levinas is concerned that when confronted by such a person, we will not see the unique, suffering human being in front of us. Instead, we'll perceive merely an instantiation of the more general category, beggar, a category which itself is part of a larger social framework. Thinking this way, we might follow Hegel and offer our own kind of theodicy, assuming the perspective of the economic system as a whole. From this vantage, beggars might simply become an inevitable outgrowth of a system that, when taken in sum, supposedly maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain. From a sufficiently global perspective of human affairs, my giving to this beggar might in fact be seen as tampering with this system, distorting economic incentives that produce the best outcomes overall. When we start to think in this way, Levinas suggests, we have lost something important. To use his term of art, we no longer see the face of the other. We think impartially in concepts and categories like the system itself. We become callous moral spectators. And the social product is a bad solidarity, one in which, to quote Levinas, no being looks at the face of the other, but all beings negate one another. A second and distinct pathology of social integration, which Levinas links to Durkheim's sociology of religion, I call self-dissolution. To explain this kind of bad solidarity, let me first say a few words, just a few, about Durkheim's thought. Informing Durkheim's theory is an innovative psychology of human desire. By this view, human beings desire not only material welfare and interpersonal recognition, they also desire the metaphysical, the numinous, that which goes beyond themselves. Indeed, it is this desire for the transcendent that for Durkheim makes society as such possible. By producing le sacré, the sacred, a society draws individuals out of the bounds of their egoism, allowing them to take part in the shared, collective, and sometimes ecstatic experience of social life. Levinas agrees with Durkheim's moral psychology. Metaphysical longing, he writes, is an indelible facet of human desire. It plays a central role in moving people past their egoism and inspiring them to contribute their energies toward collective life. But it also contains dangers. Turn to quotation 3. The numinous or the sacred envelops and transports man beyond his powers and wishes. The numinous annuls the links between persons by making beings participate, albeit ecstatically, in a drama not brought about willingly by them, in order in which they founder. This somehow sacramental power of the divine seems to Judaism to offend human freedom. The sacred that envelops and transports me is a form of violence. As Levinas suggests, access to numinous experience has historically been linked to bloodshed, to the sacrifice of life, animal or human. Often it has been politics that has led to the call for victims, invoking the divine to justify the violence of a cause, suspending the ethical by appeal to religion, or as Thomas Hobbes so vividly describes, enrolling the mysticism of theological language to legitimate social domination. At its limit, the sacred submerges people into an ecstatic frenzy, producing images like that of Agave at the conclusion of Euripides' Bacchae, raving and bewildered, holding the head of her dead son Penthus, torn from his body by her own hands, in the throes of cultic madness. For Levinas, therefore, Durkheim's sacred is a perilous path to solidarity. In the process of bringing people together, the sacred often produces a kind of irrational religious enthusiasm or fanaticism, a, quote, seething subjective mass of forces, passions, and imaginings. In the grip of the sacred, the boundaries between the individual and reality collapse. The self becomes subjectless, driven as much, if not more, by its environment than by its own volition. Levinas's concern is that such a state makes one capable of heinous crimes, acts that would be unthinkable. Agave's murder of her son, even as she is confronted by his pleading face, become feasible under the sway of the sacred. Levinas's alternative to Durkheim's sacred, le sacré, is the holy, la sanctité. It may also be his most important philosophical category. In fact, when Levinas describes his project as a whole, he rejected its characterization as a mere ethics. I'm quoting from Levinas. What really interests me in the end is not ethics alone, but the holy, the holiness of the holy. The holy has two core features. First, Levinas very explicitly links holiness to Jewish ethical monotheism. Indeed, it is precisely the moral danger of the sacred that explains Judaism's harsh attitude toward idolatry. Take a look at quotation 4. Idolatry is fought not on account of its errors, but on account of the moral degeneracy that accompanies it. In the words of Rav Yehuda, the absurdity of idolatry is strikingly apparent, but people indulge in it because it, quote, justifies public debauchery. Second, holiness offers a possible solution to the problem of containing humanity's metaphysical desire as postulated by Durkheim. If the sacred produces a, quote, immorality that can disfigure the face of my neighbor, the holy offers a picture of transcendence that maintains the dignity and ethical coherence of the other person. Notably, the Hebrew word for holiness, kedusha, also contains the connotation of separation. Thus, when Levinas describes what the authentic ethical encounter looks like, it is plainly in the mode of the holy. Yet, merely to posit the holy as a mode of ethical cognition is not sufficient. What makes it theoretically useful? To counter Durkheim, what kind of experience both draws one to another and leaves a space in between? To counter Hegel, what kind of epistemology both points to the undeniable existence of another being, but cannot reduce that being to a mere concept or instantiation of a totality? In places, Levinas terms this mode of contact a, quote, relation without relation. Yet elsewhere, he refers to it in a language that, quote, announces the ethical inviolability of the other, and without any odor of the numinous, his holiness. Levinas, in short, finds such language in a certain kind of expression that he calls religious, but it is a religion which he insists, quote, does not rest on any positive theology. References to negative theology pepper Levinas's works on Judaism, but his most direct discussion of the idea appears in one of his exegetical commentaries, The Name of God According to a Few Talmudic Texts. He opens by referring to a famous discussion in Tractate Shavuot over the effacement of the divine names. In their debate over the Mishnaic text, the rabbis arrive at an important distinction. Those names corresponding to the divinity's substantival attributes may be freely erased. By contrast, those that point in some way to the essence of the divinity may not. Here, Levinas notes, Judaism makes a critical linguistic move. While usually a thing's name, the signifier, is supposed to refer in some way to the object itself, the signified, the Jewish innovation is to divorce the two. Thus, in contrast to the French Dieu or the German Gott, the traditional divine appellations in Hebrew are meant to convey precisely the divinity that they do not themselves express, either ironically through the literal use of the word name, Hashem, or through an expression that by using the language of holiness, which again, literally separation, itself points to what is beyond itself, the Holy One, blessed be He, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The name contains nothing of what it expresses. It is a, quote, relation without a correlate, a, quote, beginning that does not move towards an end. These linguistic and theological insights hold the key to Levinas's novel moral epistemology. Levinas, I think, wants to draw upon the Jewish idea that human relations with the divine, bein adam lamakom, offer a kind of template for how we relate to other human beings, bein adam l'chavero. Compare, for example, Levinas's description of his moral epistemology from his classic work, Totality and Infinity, from a well-known passage from Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed. This is quotations 5 and 6 on your handout. In this piece of text, Maimonides summarizes the prohibition on ascribing positive attributes to the deity. It is plain that God, may he be honored and magnified, is existent of necessity, and that there is no composition in him, as we shall demonstrate, and that we are only able to apprehend his being, and cannot apprehend his quiddity. It is consequently impossible that he should have an affirmative attribute, for he has no quiddity outside of his being, and hence an attribute cannot be indicative of one or the two. Now compare Levinas's description of his own moral epistemology, quotation 6. The invoked is not what I comprehend. He is not under a category. He is the one to whom I speak. He has only reference to himself. He has no quiddity. What Levinas accomplishes through this parallel is not only an innovative ethical architecture. By making negative theology into a mode of moral cognition, he has found a way to avoid the two pathologies of solidarity associated with Hegel and Durkheim. First, it offers an alternative to Hegelian moral spectatorship. As a moral epistemology, negative theology presses attention to uniqueness rather than categorization, ethical obligation without contingency, and an absolute moral inviolability. Just as the divine is refused all analogy with other beings, a human being can no longer be safely placed into a larger category or genus, a beggar, for example, her uniqueness submerged and forgotten. This, Levinas describes as the, quote, radical reversal from cognition to solidarity. Another's particular, personal suffering can no longer be ignored because it cannot be resolved into a Hegelian system, into a totality of need and satisfaction, pain and pleasure. The abstracted, global, third-person perspective is no longer available to us. As Levinas puts it succinctly, quote, the effacement of the divine name is the reconciliation of men. Ethics as negative theology also points to an answer to Durkheim's pathology of self-dissolution, brought on by metaphysical desire. Levinas' solution here is radical. Desire for transcendence, he suggests, is channeled into the other human being herself. In other words, it is the stranger, the neighbor, the vulnerable person that becomes the target of our metaphysical longing. He signals this by applying negative theological language to ethics. Quote, the signifier, he who gives a sign, is not signified, end quote. He is likewise clear that access to the supernal must be sought through ethics. Quote, ethics is an optics of the divine. Henceforth, no relation with God is direct or immediate, end quote. In other words, what Judaism's desacralization of the sacred achieves is a divine that, quote, can be manifested only through my neighbor. Perhaps most importantly, he indicates that with the gates of heaven closed, metaphysical desire must be redirected. Quote, our relation with the metaphysical is an ethical behavior and not a theology, not a thematization, be it a knowledge by analogy of the attributes of God. In short, we discharge our otherworldly yearning, our longing for self-transcendence, through ethical action. God, Levinas concludes, rises to his supreme and ultimate presence as a correlative to the justice rendered unto men. So far, Levinas' ethical theory, as I've presented it, has assumed a largely defensive form. Levinas' appeal to negative theology answers the pair of pathologies that arise from Hegel and Durkheim's responses to the puzzle of solidarity. What remains to be explored is Levinas' own positive contribution. Recall the puzzle's central conundrum. How can self-transcendence be encouraged but contained? In what way can people be led to move beyond their egoism without giving up the personal integrity and sense of self? Time constraints prevent me from fully developing Levinas' answers, fascinating answers to these questions.
We'll read the dissertation.
Okay. And this is something I've done in a chapter of my dissertation, and so I hope we can bring out some of these details in your questions. But even so, in concluding this talk, I want to give at least the bare outlines of Levinas' practical ethical theory. So in offering his own solutions to the puzzle of solidarity, Levinas draws from two of Judaism's most evocative moral metaphors, the extension of hospitality to strangers and the offering of a sacrifice. Behind his choice of these metaphors is a novel existential theory that the concrete, physical act of giving to another is simultaneously a metaphysical event in the formation of human personality. The host or suppliant responds to the material vulnerability of the other by making herself metaphysically vulnerable. Invitations can be rebuffed, sacrifices spurned. Yet it is the very liminality of the sacrificial moment, the risk of self that must be undertaken to help the weak, that gives moral sinews to human personality. Put briefly, to become a true person, to go from mere ego to the integrity of genuine I, requires placing the needs of the other ahead of one's own. To support this point, Levinas cites a debate in the Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin, about the nature of the Messianic era. While one party, Rabbi Yochanan, imagines the period as bringing an end to both political and economic subjugation, his interlocutor Samuel argues that only political life will disappear. Indigence will remain. This is quotation 7. There is no difference between this world and the days of the Messiah, except that in the latter there will be no bondage of foreign powers, as it says, for the poor shall never cease out of the land. For Levinas, the implication of this passage is profound. Giving itself, and not merely its consequence, is central to the formation of human personality. Indeed, so important is the act of charity for an individual's existential development that it must exist even in utopia. Elsewhere, Levinas puts this idea in terms that are even more starkly existential. Only an I, he insists, can respond to the injunction of the face. Let's turn now to look at this idea through the prism of hospitality. Maimonides, in legally codifying the importance of hospitality, helps to reveal the critical connection Levinas draws between vulnerability and personality. This is the last quotation on your sheet, number 8. The welcoming of strangers, haknaset orchim, is greater than receiving the divine presence, Shekhinah, as it is written in Genesis 18:2, with regard to Abraham, as we'll see in just a minute. And he looked up and saw 3 men and ran towards them. As Maimonides notes, the language of Genesis in this famous narrative highlights both the difficulty of Abraham's condition. He had only recently been circumcised. The strangers arrive in the heat of the day. And his alacrity. He hastens and runs to make preparations. The manner in which the account is introduced also yields a rich ambiguity. In its opening, Abraham is described as having the deity appear to him. Directly following this, it states that he saw 3 strangers. This led commentators to wildly divergent interpretations, with some regarding the entire episode as a vision, Maimonides, not surprisingly, and others understanding one of these 3 men, or the men as a unit, as comprising the divinity himself. Samuel ben Meir, the Rashbam, had this view. Levinas, in commenting on the story, himself prefers the reading of Shlomo Yitzchaki, more commonly known by the acronym Rashi, and perhaps the most famous of all the medieval exegetes. According to Rashi, Abraham was actually communing with the divine when the strangers arrived. This suggests something remarkable, that hospitality is so important as to warrant abandoning God to attend to the physical needs of strangers. From this, Levinas derives 2 lessons. The first we've already seen. By displacing the deity beyond the world, the other person herself becomes the site of our ethical and metaphysical energies. Quote, the transcendence of God is his actual effacement, but this obligates us to men. His second lesson relates to an additional wrinkle in the Genesis narrative. The Midrash, or the extra-textual story from which Rashi derives his reading, notes that the deity had made the day unbearably hot, precisely to keep travelers out of the desert, and so spare Abraham, recovering from his wound, of the need to entertain guests.
It's good to have friends.
In high places, yeah. That's right. But Abraham nonetheless sat at the entrance to his tent. He could not imagine a day passing without receiving visitors. There was something about the act of hospitality itself that he regarded as critical for his personality. He believed he would not be himself, that he would not be an I, without haknaset orchim, the act of welcoming the stranger. Such moments of ethical encounter, Levinas insists, determine the, quote, infinitesimal difference between man and non-man, and they're neither rare nor exceptional. They are instead built into the very texture of modern society, and the results are available for all to see. When people choose the ego, they produce a bad solidarity. When they choose the I, when they risk their own metaphysical vulnerability in order to attend to the physical vulnerability of the other, they produce something else, a better community, a solution to the puzzle of solidarity. Thus, for Levinas, even small sacrifices matter, even the simple, after you, sir, not only because of their moral effects, but for the form of human personality they both reflect and create. I open today with 3 questions, derived from Jürgen Habermas. What insights can political theory glean from religion? In what moments do we most need them? And what more do we owe to each other? Over the course of this talk, I've tried to show that Levinas offers innovative answers to each of these questions. He does so in response to what I called the puzzle of solidarity, how we can be brought to transcend our egoism without sacrificing our moral selfhood. I began by showing how Levinas critiques 2 pathological solutions to this puzzle, Hegel's theodicy, which yields a callous moral spectatorship, and Durkheim's sacred, which leads to a perilous dissolution of the self into the collective. Levinas responds, I argued, by drawing from sources in Rabbinic Judaism, offering a novel moral epistemology based on the template of Maimonides' negative theology. I concluded by briefly outlining his own solution to the puzzle of solidarity. Levinas, I argued, constructs his positive ethical and existential program by drawing from Judaism's moral metaphors of sacrifice and hospitality. Metaphysical desire is to be channeled into other human beings, and only by the concrete act of giving can one become a genuine I. In this way, Levinas not only answers Habermas's questions, but ups the ante. It's not enough to say that religion offers untapped semantic potential for secularists. Put another way, religious traditions are not merely philosophy's equivalent of an oil reserve. Religious forms of experience and cognition, as Levinas shows us, constitute the very conditions of the possibility of society itself. They structure our everyday intersubjective experience. They ground our deepest moral concepts. For political theory, then, I think the lesson is clear. If aspects of society are grounded in sacred experience, we as theorists cannot be content with merely devising schemes for tolerating or accommodating religious traditions. Religious thought must itself be taken seriously as a source for political insight, not for purposes of translation, but on its own terms. I assume this won't qualify as news for members of Divinity School. But for those in my discipline, I hope it will lead, even in a small way, to a new program of research. The great political theorist Judith Shklar once wrote that as political theorists, our principal task is the, quote, elucidation of common experience, the expression of what is inarticulately known to groups of people at any time. Religion, I believe, has much to offer such a task of elucidation. If genuine ethical life remains a possibility in modernity, it offers resources we would be mistaken to ignore. With the collapse of bad solidarity, an authentic solidarity becomes possible. It is to the other person alone, his uniqueness, invaluability, depth, and distance that we must direct our metaphysical yearning. The other person must be given the very characteristics of the deity, elevated and separate, a vessel for the holy. Such a person must be made the object of a desire that cannot, in principle, be satiated. So channeled, such a desire cannot ignore. It cannot pass by callously. It cannot make excuses. It can only welcome, sacrifice, nurture, and take responsibility. Before wars, Levinas writes, there were altars. It is such an original sacrifice, such a founding act of welcome, that can perhaps inaugurate a genuine ethics, a genuine personality, and a genuine society. Thank you.
Have you decided which one of you would like to
Yeah.
go first?
Okay. All right, so I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of the conference for conceiving of and putting together this forum for conversation, to presenters, respondents, and guests who've joined us, to the contributors to the panel for their stimulating papers, and of course to Anne Monius for serving as the voice of Dr. Brotherton, although I wish you had been wearing three-piece suits. All right, so having studied religion and politics in a former academic life, specifically in the guise of violent religio-political movements, it's refreshing to read two papers that view politics through the lens of religion rather than the other way around. Religion is so often viewed as a pathology of politics, explained away by economic hardship, psychological trauma, or state violence. Thus, it gives one pause when Brotherton claims that Athenian democracy and Christian salvation stem from the same basic principle, the liberation from debt slavery. Similarly, Charles Lesch's paper is not only one of the most lucid papers I've ever read on Levinas, but it also serves, it's quite a feat. It also serves as a forceful example of the insight that religion can bring to secular politics, if only secular politics would listen occasionally. What appears at the core of both papers, it seems to me, is what it means to act ethically towards the other, particularly in a society such as ours that hides radical inequality and domination beneath a cloak of democratic egalitarianism. This liberal concept of egalitarianism, as Brotherton notes, relies on a contractual form of citizenship that allows for the systemic oppression of one group of people by another in the name of the free market. As he states, quote, modern performances of citizenship tacitly envisage debt as the condition of good citizenship, as debt sustains the dominant economic and political order and its corollary, a mortgage, debt-driven consumer culture in which social relations are mediated and represented through consumerist modes of common action and identity formation, end quote. Lesch similarly indicates that the economic world we live in causes us often to rationalize our response to the other in terms of Hegel's unwavering trust in totality, viewing the system itself as beyond error, and any suffering that arises in human history as a necessary outcome of the operation of that system. As Lesch says, we tend towards an abstract ethical decision-making rather than sitting with the immediacy of the other's need. Interestingly, both Brotherton and Lesch offer biblical correctives to this problem. In the case of Brotherton, the concept of the free gift and covenantal relationality. For Lesch, the satisfaction of the individual's existential need in caring for the material need of the other, epitomized in the story of Abraham's hospitality. Both of these ways of understanding the individual's responsibility towards the other in the context of the modern nation state and beyond introduce radical possibilities for rethinking the contributions of religious thought to the political sphere. Whether current forms of democracy can accommodate a subject conceived of non-juridically is a question beyond the scope of this response, but the provocation, as Charles Lesch says, is very important. To hijack Winston Churchill, just because liberal democracy is better than all the other forms of government we've tried doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying. However, in the remainder of my response, I'd like to push back a little, or perhaps it would be better to say beyond, the conclusions of our two papers. Interestingly, both papers focus on the act of charity or hospitality to an other who is imagined as being materially impoverished or vulnerable, the debtor, the beggar, the stranger in need of refreshment or rest. Yet both the salvation story of Christ's sacrifice for humanity and Levinas's insistence upon the complete alterity of the other suggest to us that the creature before us may not be accessible to us in its human vulnerability. It might come to us in the form of the mob torturing Jesus before his crucifixion, or even more unintelligibly, the unnameable, unimaginable face of the deity itself. Lesch argues, quote, human relations with the divine offer a kind of template for how we are to relate to other human beings. Yet these other human beings he discusses in his example do not, like the God of Israel, lack quiddity. They possess the face of a human being in need, a creature with whom we are biologically hardwired to identify and empathize. So a good question to ask is, what happens to our relationship to the other when we confront those who have power over us, those who want nothing to do with us, or those who we can't even recognize? I would offer that we still give a gift, we still offer hospitality, but in this case, to cite the title of an intriguing article in my field, environmental ethics, ethics becomes etiquette. Naturally, such a statement seems flippant, as though a return to mismanners might solve the pressing moral problems of our time. However, allow me, without hopefully digressing too much from the topics of today's papers, to briefly outline the argument of the essay to which I allude, Environmental Ethics as Environmental Etiquette Towards an Ethics-Based Epistemology in Environmental Philosophy, by Jim Chaney and Anthony Weston. Essentially, they claim that traditional ethics is epistemology-based. Obviously, this comes to no surprise to anyone. The idea that traditional ethics is epistemology-based entails that the world is readily knowable. So we all talked about this yesterday in our panel, what it means to know something and have that lead to a belief or decision. So the world is readily knowable, at least to the extent necessary for an ethical response. In this system, knowledge precedes practice. We must know the world and be confident in our knowledge before we can decide on a course of ethical action. Ethics is furthermore inherently incremental and extensionist. We work from givens that everyone agrees on, such as in moral philosophy, the ubiquitous, it's wrong to torture babies for fun. Most people start with that because we can all agree on that. So then it becomes extensionist. We build logically from that common center to more speculative claims. For instance, it's wrong to kill baby seals for their fur. Finally, ethics tasks itself in the traditional mode with determining what should count ethically. As the authors state, people are in, bacteria and rocks are out, and animals may be in or out depending on how much like us and unlike bacteria and rocks they turn out to be. It is, end quote. It is clear that this traditional view animates the ethics of the systems that both Lesch and Bretherton are problematizing. But I would argue that it subtly reflects the assumptions of their own conception of ethics as well, as presented in the papers we've just heard. For Bretherton, a firm understanding of what it means to be inside or outside the covenantal community seems necessary for understanding how ethical relationships should work, for example. For Levinas, as presented by Charles Lesch, ethics does seem to, Levinas says that ethics precedes epistemology. That is in fact his claim. He argues that the ability to know is premised on the formation of an I through the risk of the ethical moment. Yet one gets the feeling that some knowledge must come first when one reads Levinas. How might the non-formed I even recognize the entity before it as a face with the potential to suffer and thus respond adequately to it unless one has already developed some concept of human suffering? I certainly find Lesch's portrayal of Levinas here compelling, but for the sake of argument, and certainly it is an argument, let's say that Levinas does not go as far in revolutionizing ethics as he claims. So to return to Chaney and Weston, in contrast to this epistemology-based ethics, these two authors put forward an ethics-based epistemology. It consists of the following points. Ethical action is first and foremost an attempt to open up possibilities, to enrich the world. The phenomenon of love here is paradigmatic. We don't usually dispassionately assess someone's qualities and then decide rationally to love them. Love comes first and then opens up possibilities. The second characteristic of this ethics-based epistemology is that the world is not readily knowable. Hidden possibilities surround us at all times. Even in situations in which we think we know what's going on, hidden possibilities can reveal themselves for alternate ways of being and understanding. Third, ethics is pluralistic, dissonant, and discontinuous, not extensionist and incremental. Ethical discovery has the potential to completely upset one's entire ethical system or understanding. Unlike extensionist ethics, the center does not necessarily hold. Fourth, and finally, the task of ethics is to explore and enrich the world, not divide it into categories. As the authors say, quote, hidden possibilities surround us, and the task of ethics is to call them forth, end quote. The reason that Cheney and Weston call their ethics an etiquette is because they argue that participating in the world with its myriad other entities requires first and foremost acknowledgement, that we share the world with other people, other creatures, acknowledgement of their difference and singularity, as we've already talked about, but even acknowledgement that they don't need us and might want nothing to do with us. That entering into relationship takes time and relies on instinctive responses that one must be able to attune oneself to, which means getting rid of preconceived notions and really sitting down and listening. Etiquette suggests that comportment in relationship is the most important thing. So they conclude their paper by saying, quote, swaggering, talking too loud, not knowing how to listen, this very often innocent clumsiness we now reconceive as the fundamental ethical failure. Failure to acknowledge and understand ourselves as living in a larger animate universe, and failure too, crucially, to draw out, to co-participate with that very universe. Instead, we drive it into silence, and then take that silence to confirm our own centrality, as if we really were the only ones with anything to say, end quote. Of course, such etiquette, the relationship to the world and to other beings that it suggests, and also more importantly, the concept of the subject that it suggests, need not only apply to whales, to the divine, to the ineffable. The hidden possibilities of this ethics-based epistemology lie in everyday situations. To return to Lesch's example of the person on the street asking for money, we might pass her thoughtlessly, and her call of excuse me, draws us out of our own heads. In Levinas's account, we turn to her, ready to open ourselves to her needs, to acknowledge her singularity, to give her welcome. But vulnerability is not the face presented to our gaze. Instead, she smiles and says, I'm sorry, you dropped your hat. Suddenly, she has given us a gift. And if only for a moment, it breaks apart the I, the self that thought that it had the world all figured out. Opening a door to a stranger, I would argue, is not risky because she might reject our invitation, although that very well could happen, and that has its own power. But because the stranger fundamentally represents a threat to our integrity and our security, our selfhood, bodily and materially, but more importantly, subjectively. Untamed relationality undermines the I that serves as the foundation for epistemological confidence, leading us into uncharted territory. So I will finish by posing two questions to the contributors, to be fielded perhaps unfairly by only one.
I'll weigh in if I can.
The first is basically sort of playing off of what I've just talked about. Why should we be satisfied to open ourselves to the ineffable singularity of the other and to question the nature of our relationship to her, both ethically and politically, while preserving our own fortress of subjectivity, our traditional notion of the unified I, which has been at the root of so much of the mess that we're in? Lesch argues that opening the door to a stranger invites risk that may bring about the formation of an I. But what if the risk is that it does not, and that something completely different might develop? Should we risk discovering what that might be? My second question speaks to the practical implications of my own concerns about subjectivity, as well as Bretherton's call for understanding citizenship as covenantal, and Lesch's claim that, quote, religious thought must itself be taken seriously as a source for political insight, not for purposes of translation, but it's on its own terms, end quote. The pragmatist in me asks, how can we encourage such a mutually respectful conversation, given that, as Lesch says, the relationship between religious and secular thought is at best a détente, and at worst open animosity? At a conference entitled Religion Across the Disciplines, or William James, we may come together with at least the provisional belief that religion is an important resource for thought. And even here, it is not guaranteed that we will be able to make ourselves understood across the different disciplinary dialects that we bring together, as David Lambert said yesterday. So how can we begin to traverse the heavily fortified border that divides us from those who view religion as a pathology whose extinction is long overdue? Certainly such a question will not and cannot be answered here, but it seems to me that it must animate our attempts to make our research matter to the larger world. Thank you.
Amen.
No, Diane, come on.
No, don't worry. First of all, again, thank you, and thank you, all of you who are here. Thank you, Charlie, and thank you, Luke, in absentia. These are great papers and really provocative ideas that were promoted. I'm gonna offer some very preliminary responses to the papers themselves, but step back a little bit to ask these larger questions about the relevance of religion. How do we understand the roles that religions play in these larger ethical, political questions that we face and have always faced? How do we better understand the roles that religions have always played and continue to play in these questions? I'm reminded, as I read both of these papers, of Irving Greenberg's response to, philosophical responses to reflections on the Holocaust. He raises that challenge to us, if you're familiar with his work, where he looks at worldviews following that awful encounter of evil, human capacity for evil. And he challenged the worldviews that forged together to create what he said was this heinous representation. He challenged the legitimacy of Christianity as a worldview, the legitimacy of Judaism as a worldview, and the legitimacy of secular humanism. And he said all three of those worldviews, all three of those specters failed us in the face of burning children. For me, that is key to these larger questions. How do we keep open to the hubris of human assumption and be cautious against that in light of the ways that we can justify and have justified horrors in the name of religion and in the name of humanism? How do we wrestle and confront that reality? So both of these papers are superb in the sense that they both trace and pick up strands wonderfully. And I agree. I like Levinas now, thanks to you. Thank you. I've actually always liked Levinas. But I think that both Luke and Charlie, you both have picked up strands of religion to represent some of the best of what we can represent around religious belief. So Levinas's engagement of Maimonides, I think, is terrific, and you've rendered it beautifully. An understanding of what it means to challenge. It reminds me actually of Pascal and actually of Fromm. How do we recognize the limitation of human agency? Pascal says, of course, we live within two infinities. In the midst of these infinities, we can't know the absolute truth or the absolute ultimacy of God, yet we can't also claim absolute knowledge, ignorance, or powerlessness. We live in this ambiguity, this place of deep ambiguity, and that can cause us consternation, but the power of faith can then lead us to want to at least attempt to recognize our limitation, but also to continue to own our power. And then Fromm, who challenges and says we should practice idology rather than theology, because idology, we can't know God, we can't know the ultimate, but we can know what we replace the ultimate with, idols. So he says we can't talk of God, theology is itself a futile endeavor. We can recognize the idols that we put before us and worship, patriotism, often religion, often certain notions of God, and challenge ourselves to erase those from our ultimate consciousness, our ultimate aspiration, to leave room for the revelation of the holy. So I love what you've done with Levinas's understanding. But that's a particular understanding, a particular interpretation of Judaism. There are a whole host of other interpretations of Judaism that are going to be very triumphalist. They're going to absolutely claim, as we do in Christianity, as we do in Buddhism, as we do in Hinduism, as we do in all religious traditions, to be able to claim and give license to a very triumphal ethical foundation that will give legitimacy to a whole host of horrors. And so my ultimate question for both papers or both authors of the papers, is how do we wrestle with a way to understand the roles that religions and secular humanisms play? Is there anything that allows us across the board to live in the particular representation, there are others, of that Pascalian truth, if you will, that can lend itself to challenge our propensity toward hubris and the ways that we use religion across every discipline, but certainly in political theory? We either ignore it or we use it selectively. My question is, religion's always present. Your question, are they coextensive? Yes. Religion is always here. Religion is always embedded in every dimension of human experience. It is used absolutely to give legitimacy to the full range of human ethical action. Always, has always been, will always continue to be. So religion is not a positive force, not a negative force, but a very strong force. How do we teach, and when we think about religion across the disciplines, how do we better understand the ways that religions are used, the ways that religions are appropriated to promote things that we will celebrate and promote things that we will, that make us shudder? And how do we also help? The one thing that I think religion provides for us that secular humanism doesn't is that understanding that there's something beyond us in the best dimensions of religion, not always. We often do claim from idolatry or ideology. We often use religion in an idolatrous fashion. But how do we help temper that sense that we are not in full control here? Again, not with a normative assumption about that, but with an understanding of that. And it seems to me that when we think more broadly about the roles that religions play, we need to understand that, and we can't just selectively choose. And I'm not implying that you are doing that, but I'm saying I think it's our challenge for all of us. The ways that there are dimensions of religion that I think would be wonderful to incorporate, but I think more importantly, recognizing the roles that religions already are playing, to give license to Luke's assertion of rights-based foundations for citizenship. Protestant Christianity is absolutely deeply embedded with modern capitalist assumptions and the notion of contractual arrangements. That's not secular. There's a deeply rooted Protestant impulse that gives license to that form of economic understanding. So religion's always there. How is it there? How do we better understand the roles that religions play, and how do we discern those roles, and then how do we also draw on the strengths of religion but also challenge its representation? And now I'm going to sing Moon River. Thank you.
Would you like to?
Sure. I mean, I don't think I'll be able to do justice to such a rich and suggestive array of comments. So I'll do my very best to respond to just a few of the kind of insights that you've given, and then we can hopefully have a larger conversation. So I'll start with Diane. So one of the things that you mentioned is that you began with Irving Greenberg and the notion that after the Holocaust, the structures of meaning with which people orient themselves somehow fail, that they are inadequate to account for this catastrophe. And I think that Levinas, something I don't mention here, but I do mention in the broader chapter, is that Levinas is crafting his ethical theory almost, and in fact he says this as a response to the Holocaust. I mean, and it was he had his own experience, in camps, and a lot of his family was wiped out, and so this was something that hovers over his entire philosophical project. I just want to suggest one thing kind of that comes out of that, which is that when I identified these two different pathologies of solidarity, I would like to suggest that Levinas actually saw those two pathologies in different ways at work in the Third Reich. So on the one hand, a kind of indifference, right, to one's neighbors, a willingness to kind of let the people who are closest to you in geography just be sent away without raising one's voice, right? So on the other hand, the kind of ecstatic relinquishing of ethical obligation that comes as part of a mass rally, a kind of what Adorno and Horkheimer called a mimesis of mimesis, a kind of channeling, a false channeling of a kind of primitive, right, gathering. I mean, I'm using that term obviously not politically correctly, but that's how they use it, in the sense of that Hitler saw himself as reproducing this kind of pre-modern paganistic energy. And that's clearly what's at work when Levinas is critiquing the sacred. I mean, that's what he has in mind. Now, the question that you then asked, as I understood it, is, okay, so given that religion has caused, or has been at least a part of, or has been drawn up from, in order to bring about some of these pathological social outcomes, how do we both use religion as something that we can deploy to prevent these without then falling back into those own pathologies? And one thing that you mentioned, but I think is actually very important, is that Levinas's reading of Judaism is a very specific reading of Judaism. And I think that he, more than some other thinkers about Judaism, is actually very explicit about the kinds of Judaism he doesn't like. And he's a real Litvak. I mean, I don't know, he's a real Lithuanian anti-mystic, anti-irrationalist, really kind of I mean, I didn't have the space to go into this in this paper, but places Talmudic study, actually, at the center of ethical development, because Talmudic study is regarded as a kind of attention to the particular over the abstract. Because to study Talmud, you begin from cases and you work upward to concepts generally, as opposed to beginning with concepts and working downward to cases, which is what a lot of philosophy does. And so the reading of Judaism that Levinas gives is a very particular one, and it certainly can't be abstracted to Judaism as a whole, but it's the one that he sees as able to kind of thread the needle between these different pathologies. So and you can test that obviously, and it's a longer conversation, but I personally find it very attractive in a lot of ways, as is probably evident. Okay, so now, Tara, there were so many different questions and comments. No, it was wonderful. I hope we have a chance to talk about more of it. I'm just going to draw out two of the things you said and respond, and then maybe we can talk about more of them. So the first, and this was in the context of the article you referenced from Cheney and Weston, is that right? Okay. So you talked about this idea of attunement to the other, or acknowledgement of the other, as a kind of alternative form of how we structure our ethical life. And what's interesting is that, so the part of this paper that I had to excise, which is at the very end, is where I talk about what I call Levinas's micropolitics. Now, this is a strange term to ascribe to Levinas, because Levinas is often seen as a kind of ethical anarchist, actually, by a lot of his readers. And I think that's an easier reading, but I think it's actually incorrect, because Levinas is very much a proponent of the state of a certain kind. But what he does see as a role for a kind of politics is in everyday ethical life, where he thinks that we need to be attuned to divergences in power between different people, that we can't just submerge inequalities of power beneath formalistic rights conceptions, like Luke was talking about in his paper. That we actually need to bring these to the surface of our ethical attention. And to talk about this, he he has a commentary on the laws of manslaughter in Judaism, in the Hebrew Bible, I should say, which are, some of the most baffling, right? Laws of manslaughter in the Hebrew Bible are, if you commit manslaughter, you're neither, I guess, explicitly innocent or explicitly guilty. You can flee to a city of refuge. So a lot of scholars, Bible critics have seen this as just a product of, the lack of full development of the Jewish or the Israelite legal system at the time, that this was a kind of way of dealing with the fact that they weren't sure how to place these different people, that the altar was seen as a form of a site of refuge, and so people could flee to the altar. And they saw it as basically a manifestation of the underdevelopment of the Israelite legal system. Levinas says, no, there's actually something important and revealing about this institution. What is it? It's that these people are precisely somewhere in the netherland between guilty and innocent. And the legal system wants to reflect that. It wants to say, yeah, it was an accident that they killed a person, but they were negligent, right? The Talmud's example, actually, that it uses to reflect on these is an axe head flying off of its handle and striking someone accidentally. And I think it's in Tractate Makot. And the implication for Levinas is important. It means that we need to be attuned to more facets of our everyday ethical experience than we currently are. That we need to make more features of everyday life actually into moral questions. Things that we would not even assume are moral questions, like checking an axe head, right? That's the metaphor. Become moral questions when we think more deeply about everyday experience. I don't think that directly answers the question of attunement or acknowledgement, but I do think that there's actually quite a bit of attention in Levinas to some of these kinds of questions about attention to details, the details of ordinary ethical life. And then the final thing I want to address is this kind of reinvention of what it means to welcome a stranger at one's door, and some of the possible bad outcomes that can come, right, or kind of from the risk of opening one's door to a stranger. And how maybe this doesn't result in becoming a real I. Maybe it doesn't result in becoming a real ethical actor. Maybe instead it results in maintaining one's egoism. That's how I kind of understood what you were, the last part of what you were saying. So I think that, so Levinas, when he, one of the other ways in which Levinas is responding to Hegel, which I didn't get a chance to talk about in this presentation, is responding to Hegel's dialectic of master and slave as the prototype for the development of the subject. So very briefly, for those of you not familiar with the master-slave dialectic, it's a kind of state of nature parable. What it says is that two human beings initially encounter one another. Each of them encounter each other as an ego. One of them, they engage in a fight to the death. One of them prevails when he's willing to take the risk of his own physical welfare. He's willing to set aside his physical welfare for the sake of winning the fight, for the sake of his prestige. And the other one instead decides to set aside his prestige to preserve his physical welfare. And the person who wins the fight becomes the master, and the person who loses the fight becomes the slave. And this sets into motion human history. So now for Hegel, the end of this dialectic of human history is where both human beings, or all human beings really, are in a state of where their subjectivities are mutually recognized. So the conflict ends, basically. What Levinas points out, and Levinas was reading Hegel through Kojève, so it's kind of actually a distortion of Hegel, but that's another conversation, is that the ego actually never goes away. That at the end, the violence of the original exchange is kind of sublimated into society itself. And so precisely the risk of opening the door is that someone who opens the door might be transformed, but only if they're willing to kind of take this leap and become a real subject. There's always the risk of kind of moving back into one's egoism and original violence. And that was a very shortened version of kind of how this argument goes. But anyway, we can bring out more of that if necessary. And I just wanted to thank you both again. Those were fantastic responses. Thank you.
Questions from the audience? We have a few minutes before we go to have some coffee break, and recharge ourselves for the second panel. Any questions? Jason?
My question's for you.
They're all for him.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I
we could
if
change
not-
that, Jason.
Or if he hasn't said anything, maybe what do you think he would say?
Right.
I'm curious in terms of thinking about like something like the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Would Levinas see that, something like that, falling into the same pitfalls, obviously a Durkheimian or Hegelian sort of understandings of ethics, or does it sort of contradict with his attempt to get at this sort of one-to-one, face-to-face ethical relationship, or is it something that could be brought down to that level,
Yeah.
and so it doesn't fall into the same pitfalls? I'm
It's
just curious.
it's an excellent question, and it's something I get a lot when I talk about Levinas in this context. So Levinas, I should say, is not an opponent of human rights regime or of the social welfare state, I should say, actually. He's very explicit about that. He's a good social democrat, actually, in his European politics. What he does think is we can't make the mistake of thinking that those institutions are a replacement for the forms of everyday ethical life that he is describing. In other words, the mistake is not when we have those institutions, period. The mistake is when we falsely believe that those institutions are enough, and that we can kind of then completely, to use an economic metaphor I dislike, outsource our obligation to those institutions and to the legal structures that they're a part of. And that kind of ethical outsourcing or displacement is something that that's what he's very skeptical of. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, Ian.
So I have a number of ways of saying this, what I think is really the same question, so I'll be as simple as possible. And really it comes down to what I'm wondering what your or Levinas's ambitions would be for this kind of new philosophy. So let me put it this way. First, let's say that what you're articulating is a sort of a third way, an alternative form of self-transcendence, as opposed to sort of other competing systems of transcendence. Do you see these as differing only in degree or actually in kind from one another? And the reason I ask that is really that I wonder if you see this applying in the world at a level that is compatible with, for example, other what I'm calling competing forms of transcendence, such as nationalism, or one that actually is going to have to sort of make itself heard in a way that the other forms of transcendence may also lay a claim to doing some of the existential work for the individual that I think Levinas has in mind. So are those things at odds with one another, or are they in some ways, how does this go into effect in an ambitious, universal way?
That is a fascinating question, and I don't think I'll be able to formulate a full response, but I'll do my best. So these two pathologies that I laid out here of self-transcendence are for Levinas extremes of types of self-transcendence that can manifest to a lesser degree in other forms of life. So nationalism, for example, is something that Levinas would see as approaching one of these extremes in certain manifestations, especially Durkheim's sacred, right? Now, where Levinas is actually less clear about this is when he talks about Zionism. And he has a lot of different essays about Zionism. But Levinas is a Zionist, but he's a Zionist of a very interesting kind, where he thinks that Zionism, at its best, represents a kind of nationalism that can avoid certain pathologies of nationalism. I think that he does that by basically turning Zionism to something which is not nationalism, in a sense, by emphasizing the fact that this is going to be a state that actually takes very seriously this kind of ordinary ethical life, and sees the role of the state, qua state, as very much a kind of institution emptied of these aspirations that we would put into it, the nationalist aspirations we put into it. So, if I had to put him in the spectrum of contemporary Israeli politics or even just global politics, thinking about the role of the state, it would be basically a secular institution, a kind of providing order, providing also social welfare, but not really fulfilling those needs for identity or those needs for community. He would think that that would be dangerous. That would be a kind of tying in those needs of community identity to an institution that's capable of violence. And so I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I do think that he in general is very skeptical of other ways of channeling this desire for self-transcendence. That there's always a slippery slope, in a sense, towards the pathologies.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
I just wanted to talk. Does he see Zionism as necessarily leading to the place of Israel?
To the state.
No, not the state, the place.
The physical location.
Yes.
Yeah, my impression based on his essays is yes, certainly. And of course, I mean, there's a long tradition of Zionism which has de-emphasized the role of the state, but has emphasized the role of the place. I mean, going back to people like Buber, right? Going back to people like Walter Benjamin. So I mean, there are alternatives, and I think he does see the place as important. Yeah.
Could you say just one more word about that? Because it seems to me that once you locate it in that place,
Yeah.
certain things about the state that will follow become self-evident. I mean, do they deal with this?
I don't entirely understand your question.
So the idealistic notion of state falls away once you put Israel where it is. That's what I'm making a statement there to try to evoke to try to get at your not understanding my question.
Right. Well, I on this particular question, I'd have a hard time putting myself in Levinas's head, I think.
And I'm just thinking. I mean, I'm not.
Yeah. I mean, I in his writings on Zionism, I mean, in part, he's coping also with the fact that this is just a reality. That I mean, there are people there, and so, in other words, that Jews immigrated to the land prior to the state, and so, you know, I don't exactly know what you're getting at in particular, but.
Well, I was seizing on something that you said about his notion of state.
Yeah.
Which is seems to be a softening, if you will, of what we typically think of as a state, right? Can you say more about that?
Depends what you mean by softening. I mean, I think his view of the state is actually not particularly original in terms of his political theory. His view of a state is a kind of mechanism for achieving social order and a mechanism for redistributing wealth. That's not where the work of his political theory is really taking place. I mean, it's really taking place in a kind of social solidarity and everyday ethical level. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
Tara, I just loved your presentation. There's so much there, and I want to read the other article that you referenced, but I just want to hear a little more about this idea of etiquette. And I loved how you put a twist on it, because I feel like so many of the ethical situations always assume the position of like the one giving to the beggar, but what if you're the beggar? You know, what if you're the one without the power? What if you're the one in debt? What if that's where you're starting from your ethical position? Then what do you do in terms of your ethical, you know, and etiquette, or just the situation of, you know, how do you act non-violently in a situation of great oppression or violence? So I just wondered, could you say a little more about that idea and how you think of it?
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, I actually was kind of thinking at the same time about Levinas because, you know, he also says, you know, the face of the other puts demands on me even if the other is hurting me or is a killer or is, you know, even if that person, see, that's the interesting thing about what Cheney and Weston are saying about epistemology-based ethics is it's based on a sense of like, who counts morally, right? Who gets moral consideration? Right. And in many cases, you know, the person who commits genocide or doesn't get moral consideration. They almost fall out of the realm of moral consideration because they have so egregiously violated the rules of the social contract that we live in, right? But Levinas himself actually says no. That person, because ethics is primary, the face always requires moral consideration, regardless of. That's the interesting thing about Levinas is it's the singularity, but without a particular. Do you know what I mean? Without a particularity of their like history, like they represent a singularity that one must respond to, but irrespective of who they actually are and what they represent.
Yeah, so that's actually where I would disagree. But I think that's a very good reading of Levinas. What I would want to argue is actually there's an additional layer to his ethics, which again I called the kind of micro-political layer, which is where there's actually good evidence that Levinas does think that we should care about these individual facets of the other person's particular identity, their particular weaknesses, their particular background. Now, that's not the kind of original ethical moment. Right? That's not what inspires us to originally help. That we do without attention to any of their characteristics. But then once we're engaged, then we have to actually be very careful that we're attuned to their particularity. So, but I think that's a nice distinction, actually, between the kind of uniqueness and particularity. They're almost two stages of the ethical theory. Yeah.
Right. And I think that that actually also returns to the notion of what Weston and Cheney are saying in their article. They're actually discussing specifically animals. And in one section they say, they're talking about the ways in which professional animal trainers will relate to animals within their own sort of environment, and the ways that normal people essentially relate to animals. And what they say is that the animal trainer is specifically attuned, as you're saying, to the particularity of each animal, not only in that species of animal and how their body language and how their sort of habits suggest an invitation or a sort of stay away, but also each individual animal and how they're, so actually it's, well, again, we're not talking about animals, we're talking about humans, but it's actually an interesting parallel in the sense that, it really just, it has more to do with an almost visceral, intuitive, almost like body language, and I think that that's why they talk about comportment and they talk about etiquette, because it's sort of, it's on a level that's almost it's cognitive. You're not necessarily thinking about it, but at the same time you have to be, the ethical moment is the moment of being attentive to the other, not only their specified needs, but their sort of unspoken needs or their unspoken, ways of relating to you and to the rest of the world, so.
Any other questions?
Diane, forgive me for not knowing Greenberg's work, but I just wanted to ask a clarification question. The way you said that Judaism, Christianity, and secular humanism had let humanity down in preparation for an event like the Holocaust, does Greenberg equate their letting down? In other words, did they all fail equally? And because I would want to quarrel with that energetically.
Pretty much. He does have some equation in the sense that they mask they promote, they can and often do promote a sense of hubris in human encounters with one another, and a sense of assumption that is not inevitably challenged as fundamental, and that without that challenge of a sense of propriety, it can lead to something, the specter of the Holocaust. So he does, and I find him actually pretty compelling in that regard, because it's in a sense a hindsight response, but it's also a very present day response where he says, what do we do with this now? We can't just move along and assume that these same structures, these same worldviews are going to be adequate for us if we really take seriously the call of never again.
Forgive my ignorance, but there seems to be a cause and effect there that he is ignoring. I mean, Judaism doesn't act on Christianity the way Christianity has acted on Judaism, and I wonder about how he, if in fact he leaves that out, how he does it.
He absolutely would agree with that comment, but he will say that there are different pathways that gave legitimacy or give legitimacy to hubris, but that they still exist, and that's what we need to challenge. So definitely different pathways, different representations.